This is my review for Dream Deceivers, the story behind James Vance versus Judas Priest, dated 1992. So, as always, this is a review that I wrote. I've been getting comments where some people are like, "Why aren't you looking at the screen?" And I'm reading the review that I wrote. I know that's a hard concept for people to understand, to write down your thoughts, but some of us still do that. So, obviously, when I'm looking away, this is me looking at my computer screen to make sure everything is still running and me, reading what I fucking wrote. So, get over yourselves. I'm not looking at the camera. Also, it's really nice out. Obviously, it's very bright. It's like 1, almost 2 p.m. So, going with a lot of natural lighting. So, hopefully, I don't look too crazy. So, anyway, Dream Deceivers is a documentary that was created by David Van Taylor, which came out in 1992. Some of these broadcasts will say 92, 91. This one, I'm just going to say, came out in 92. So it talks about the tragic story, very, very tragic story of James Vance and Raymond Belknap, or yeah, I believe it was Raymond Belknap, who were two young people that shot themselves on the evening of December 23rd, 1985. Raymond died immediately, while James somehow survived, but he was permanently disfigured. The subject of the documentary is very heavy, and for many people, it would be too hard to watch, admittedly. James was interviewed throughout the film before his eventual death. On the evening of the shootings, as the family would call it, Raymond, who was 18, and James, 20, made a suicide pact. And I'm just saying this, for anybody else that has never really heard of this or knew as much about the details to the story like I originally didn't. So the two went to a church playground, and while under the influence of various substances, they committed and attempted suicide. Raymond shot himself first, and then James, who was scared, took the gun second, which he said later on in the film. Not much is really talked about how James was found, or the reconstructive surgeries that he ended up having to go through. From what you see in the footage, you could see that the doctors did the best that they could. And in many ways, for me, I found it very shocking that James survived. You know, so from the opening scenes, we see a home life with James and his mother. At first, it appears that he has a loving mother who seems sweet and nice. She cooks for him and brings him plates of food. She seemed to understand what he was saying, and she would help the viewer better hear him. She would kind of basically translate his words, as his disfigurement left his mouth seemingly unable to completely close. From early in the film, we see that James's mother, Phyllis, was religious. So, to preface, decades ago, I had heard about this case against Judas Priest and the idea of backmasking in music. This was way before we had access to new articles and freely seeing documentaries such as this one, so I never got to know the full story. I didn't know how it went down, and I did not know that in reality it was so brutal. To quickly sum up, after the shootings and Raymond's suicide, their families filed a civil suit against the band Judas Priest. Their claim was that the band's music had subliminal messages in it, the main one being "Do It," which was purported to be the reason why the two tried to take their lives. I always knew that the case was dismissed, though I didn't know many of the inner workings of it. When I was in high school, I had to write a paper on censorship as a persuasive argument, and this case was among the ones that I used. The idea was that backmasking is a flawed concept because many people will be told what they are to hear. And so when you play this backwards recording, that is what they quote unquote hear. Now, the other contention against backmasking is the fact that not only will people hear something if you tell them what they're going to hear, If you don't tell them beforehand and you just play the audio, many times people won't hear anything. So that was one of the arguments I remember writing about when I was in high school, and did a little bit of, I guess, research that would have been available back in the early 2000s about this Judas Priest case. You see a scene in the film that seems to touch on this backmasking contention, as Rob Halford, who's the singer to the band Judas Priest, is seen saying in the courtroom, saying something about like something that was going to be played backwards, about wanting a peppermint, right? Or asking for one. And then he plays whatever song it was backwards. And of course, once you hear Halford play this sound, it sounds exactly like what he said about, wanting a peppermint. The majority of the court details aren't really talked about in the film, though that might have been due to the time restraints. The documentary is about an hour, so they probably couldn't have fit much more in, especially since I believe this was broadcast originally on PBS, so I don't think they would have allowed for probably a 1.5 to 2 hour film. Anyway, though, I do wish that they could have talked about the legal section more, but I understand why they didn't and likely couldn't do so. At the end of the film, the families were reportedly trying to appeal the case's dismissal, though, of course, in the decades since, we know that this didn't work. Even though Raymond's mother was interviewed and seen in the film, you see a lot more about James Vance's mother, Phyllis, and about the life that James had. I will say, though, it hurt in a way when Raymond's mother stated that it took her a long time before she really understood that her son was never coming home. The focus on James's family really showed a dysfunctional and abusive household. The dynamic was incredibly toxic, where his mother seemed to focus so much on religion and was putting down her son's interests. She called Judas Priest garbage music, with a big smile on her face, by the way. By this time, James Vance had been saying that Judas Priest was one of the reasons why he attempted suicide. They even show a note that James wrote as proof. Is that in the camera? I always say that, as proof. I know how this is going to sound, but I do question if his mother forced him to write that and say those things after he survived his suicide attempt. You can't really... I'm not going to say anything else about that. But anyway, I question if many of the things that happened with this case is because James was a tortured soul and he just wanted some kind of relief. It's very clear that James was suffering. His father or stepfather, this seems to be rather unclear, because one of the scenes in the movie shows Phyllis going to, like, an attorney's office, and Phyllis says something that her husband isn't James's biological father. So I don't know if that's really true or not. But either way, his father or stepfather, the man she was married to, is seen on camera smiling at the fact that he punched James with his fists in the past when James was caught having smoked marijuana. It was also revealed that James's mother was beat on by her husband early in their relationship. Shockingly, she minimizes this and saying it was only the first year or two. The man was also an alcoholic, and once again, Phyllis is seen saying, "Who doesn't have a drinking problem?" My God. There are multiple instances where the mask drops off for Phyllis, and the viewer begins to understand why James wanted to end his life, to be very blunt. The defense lawyer did a very great job, in my opinion, the lawyer who was defending Judas Priest, from the shots that they had showed in the film. She brought up psychiatric evaluations, and these were probably the biggest contention against the prosecution's argument that Judas Priest induced the shootings and suicide. It was revealed in the times before James shot himself that he was severely depressed and wanted to end his life. What's surprising was how James's mother did not like how this was brought up in court and was seen saying that the defense lawyer would have to answer to God for that one. That really showed the mentality Phyllis had. She couldn't take accountability at all. There are examples that both of the guys were suffering, to put it simply. As a viewer, it was clear that the examples of dropping out of school, not keeping a job, doing drugs, shooting animals, and things of the like were indications of something much more going on in their lives, and not the music they listened to. Through the film, there are clips of metalheads unrelated to the case that are interviewed. Everyone knew that the court case was bullshit and that they didn't have a leg to stand on. I think it was very important that the director showed how music, even heavy metal, can connect with people and bring them together. Despite James and Raymond's families trying to blame the music for their actions, the two guys were initially fans before they hurt themselves. And I forgot to write this down, but at the end of the film, James had brought up the lyrics to one of the Judas Priest songs. What was it? Dreamer, Deceiver, which I believe, right? This is what this is named after. And so Rob Halford was like, oh, he brought up, those lyrics. I wonder why, and it was just very interesting that it was made aware to Rob Halford that one of his own songs affected James, deeply. And not in a bad way. You could tell that the song Dreamer Deceiver seemed to really resonate with James Vance's heart, the lyrics to it. But anyway, this is a very heavy subject. I watched this film probably about 4 or 5 days before I even recorded this video. And I've just been sitting here thinking about it, just thinking about it and thinking about it because it's so heavy. And you think about how James and Raymond didn't have to suffer. And yet, unfortunately, they did. So anyway, in many ways, it was clear to me that James had little relief in his life. And what relief he did find was through music. It was very sad to me that his mother refused to take his interests seriously. And she just cast them aside as evil and bad. When Phyllis was asked what type of music she listened to, of course, she smiled and she talked about religious music. And she specifically said Western. She grew up with listening to Western music. And I found this interesting because it was like a way to not only prove that heavy metal was bad and her music taste was good, but there were no specific artists mentioned that she listened to. I bring this up because so much emphasis is placed on how the metal bands were the cause of the suicides. Ironically, if you listen to Hank Williams Sr., a famous country artist, and to me, I would imagine that Phyllis would have heard of Hank Sr. She was born in 1947. So to me, I just imagine, this is speculation, but she likely heard Hank Williams Sr. growing up. So anyway, my point is that this artist, who is a country music artist, created some of the most depressing fucking music ever. I mean, seriously. Hank Williams Sr., a famous country music artist, has a lot of depressing music. Hank talked about killing himself quite a lot, as seen in songs like Long Gone Lonesome Blues. And to quote the lyrics to that song, some of it goes, I'm gonna find me a river, one that's cold as ice. And when I find me that river, Lord, I'm gonna pay the price. Oh, Lord, I'm going down in it 3 times, but Lord, I'm only coming up twice. He's talking about killing himself. And so it's just ironic to me that heavy metal was thought of as the big bad guy, the evil villain, when, what is that, 30, 40 years before? Judas Priest, because Priest, or no. Okay, it was about 20 some years before Judas Priest, give or take, that Hank Williams Sr. was making songs like this. So my point is that, it's never brought up in other genres when, somebody makes a very depressing song. So I really wonder if Phyllis ever listened to that song in particular or any of other Hank's music, such as I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. Once you start looking at other artists, especially out of the metal genre, the idea of metal being the culprit to suicide falls apart. This seems to be sort of brought up when one of the family members are brought on the stand. And I believe she was a sister to Raymond, as James had stated in the film that he was an only child. The sister had attempted suicide in the past multiple times, and she admitted that she wasn't a fan of heavy metal. It made me question what was going on at that home for multiple siblings to the same family to attempt suicide. At the end of the film, James Vance had passed away, and we see a part of his funeral. What's really disturbing is that Phyllis, James's own mother, did not cry. Not on film, not that we saw. In fact, it looked like she was smirking. That's really disturbing. And right beside her was her husband, James's father, stepdad, whoever that guy was. But her husband, the man who admitted to beating James with his fists, was the one crying and wiping his eyes, and not James's mother. And I think that says a lot. At the time of his death, James's death wasn't considered a suicide, though in the years since it seems like people believe that it was, and myself included. James slipped into a coma after overdosing on drugs, which some articles, or at least, let's just say, it floats around on the internet that it was something to do with methadone. James apparently had been admitted to the hospital on November 15th, 1988, for depression. He slipped into a coma the day he was supposed to be released. And in an article from the LA Times, doctors told James's mother that he was 99.9% brain dead. I question, where did he, not where, because obviously he was hospitalized, but more like how did he get the drugs that he overdosed on, And has anybody else thought the same thing I did, where James didn't want to go home? He'd rather go home than actual home. You catch my drift? So, according to Find a Grave, James passed away on November 29th, 1988 in Reno, Nevada. He's buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Reno. He was only 23 years old. At the time of his death, he actually had a 1-year-old daughter. James's father, the person who was married to Phyllis, passed away in 2005 and was buried in the same cemetery as him. Interestingly, Phyllis, James's mother, died in 2015 and was cremated. Overall, I really did enjoy this film. It's not perfect. It's rather low quality, but I believe it was made for TV. So it's rather low quality, in like production, and the audio's not the greatest. But I think that it's a very important film and very important piece of history. Seriously. I think that this film is really great in the sense that it shows the not so perfect side to the story. The director could have very easily left out all those scenes, all those moments that not necessarily, they make Phyllis look bad, but also, not only do they make her look bad, but they prove that her case had no leg to stand on. You know what I mean? Like, the director could have very well left that out, but he didn't. He kept that in, and I give him props for that. Through what they could show, they showed all of the things that they filmed that made the court case flawed. And for that, I do think that this is a great film. This might sound surprising, but I give this a 5 out of 5. Seriously. I have to admit, it's a very heavy subject, heavy topic to watch. But for the sake of, even just in the smallest part of showing a piece of history about a frivolous lawsuit. I think that this is important for that. It's important to show that you can't just sue because of something that you don't agree with, if we're going to put it that way. So you can find this online somewhere, anywhere. It's not that hard to find if you want to watch it and if you're interested in Judas Priest. And that's it.